Jasmine Crockett gave a very haunting crumb in regards to how she thinks the litigation that she's going to position against Texas for the redistricting that would basically remove her seat because they're going to remove her away from the district that she's representing. She said that they may win the battle, but they will not win the war, which tells us that she knows that the courts are going to be aligned with a much more conservative take on this, right? And that reality, it gives us the urgency even more of blue states leveraging our power, our economy, in order to be capable of putting pressure and actually going teeth to teeth against the MAGA party, right? Because ultimately, what's going to happen is that right now, blue states are threatening, right? My governor is threatening, but are they actually going to do it? That's the question. And what we tend to do as the people is that we just wait, right? We're just like, it's gonna happen, like obviously it's gonna happen, but ultimately what we have to acknowledge is that what the blue states are going to have to do in order to do something like that is sacrifice itself, right? Is to ultimately make itself vulnerable to retaliation from the federal government. Like California continues to see it, even if our governor tried to appease him, which he did, right? But ultimately they keep, trying to encroach on our state rights, encroach on our constitutional liberties. So ultimately appeasement doesn't work. But the way that blue states have been positioning is that every man for themselves, right? Every state for themselves. And ultimately the senators, the representatives are going to vote in alignment with what's best for the state, even if that's not best for all blue states, right? And that's something that we as a people within the blue states have to shift and actually have to challenge and have to demand our state governor, our state government to actually leverage our states for the best of democracy, for the best of the union, for the best of red states, including Texas, right? But also those who will follow Texas. Now, how do we do this? I would say that it has to be both people and blue states and people and red states actually vocalizing in a much more unionized, much more marching, much more protest kind of way. How do we do this? Now, I would say that this requires both people in the blue states and people in the red states having simultaneous kind of campaigns that demand similar things. One is people in blue states actually mobilizing within a sort of format, kind of like No King's Day, except I would say much more of a rally than a protest, because what we want is to position that there's enough of us who are okay with sanctioning the leveraging of our state, even if that comes at some consequences, for the better of democracy, for the better of the country, for the better of the people in red states who are going to lose on their representation, not because of a political shift that is constitutional, but because of a one man rule who's utilizing those shortcomings of the Constitution and of the guardrails or lack of guardrails in order to maximize on his power so that he can utilize the lawfulness and reshaping of the law in the Constitution in order to keep power, even if it's not for him, it's for MAGA, right? The ideology he wants to continue and maintain in power across the branches, but also across the states. He wants to make blue states into red states. How? Through these, right? So we have to fight teeth for teeth. So I would say some sort of rally, right, when it comes to the blue states where there's, I would hopefully millions of, let's say, Californians who show up and rally and just, I would say like party it up or chill it up or picnic it up. It doesn't have to be anything serious, just showing up in numbers to say, hey, we're here and we want you to maximize on our state power in order to actually put pressure on the system to try to stop it, right? Because ultimately, like what Governor Newsom said, that in positioning the special election in November, hopefully other states follow along. So we have to accelerate that. And this is the way, right? Because ultimately, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, did it actually fall, right? They can always say that they didn't know that the people wanted it. They can always say that, I was just trying to do what's best for the state, even though it's going to come at the cost of the country, of the union, right? They can always say that, we just didn't show up enough, right? It was just digital voices. They didn't actually know that so many people wanted to actually leverage the state, right? So ultimately the traditional channels of calling of a petition, those can just be ignored, right? Which is historically what has happened. When it came to the campaign for a constitutional crisis, even though the logic was on point, it was just like, we don't want to challenge the peace that's happening. We didn't want to challenge the illusion of American, exceptionalism. So we're not going to do this because it's out of tradition. So we have to force them to through a way, right? So ultimately on the simultaneous day as the rally within blue states, I would say, and red states, there would have to be protests. Not necessarily like crazy protests because you're not demanding from your state. You're actually trying to seek out solidarity, not just from, the people within blue states, but also the government of blue states. Because ultimately, it's not the same of Californians being like, hey, we need to help Texas, because ultimately state rights say that you kind of are, guided within the boundaries of your state, and you can encroach on those rights of other states if you try too much to intervene, right? So ultimately, it has to be people in red states being like, hey, come help us, right? So ultimately, these protests within red states would just be like, hey, California, New York, blue states, we need your help, because ultimately there's a difference, right, between Californians wanting to help Texas and Texas being like, California, please help us. It's much more of a service versus one where California is just trying to invoke our, let's say, culture on Texas, right? So it has to be red states and those people in it, right? Saying, hey, we need your help. We need you to maximize on whatever powers you have. So ultimately, these two types of rallies or protests happening at the same time. And within blue states, I would say give a time frame to our state government, saying you have X amount of like days or whatever to have a concrete plan as to how we will move forward on moving that gerrymandering of our state to combat that of Texas, right? And if not, I would say that's when blue states would protest, such as disrupting the systems and channels of commerce, such as the ports. These are things that would put pressure on our state to know that we're serious, right? Because ultimately, it's going to take we the people actually utilizing democracy channels like that, like protests, like rallies, like letting them know we're numbers, like you cannot ignore us because we're on the streets and we're telling you how many of us it is, in order to actually force them to act on what they should do to ensure that this administration is much more slower at gaining its actual consolidation of powers and its consolidation of elections, because unless we do this, the election is secured for him and we cannot allow for him to do this. So we have to force that action of our state government, and that starts with us actually, organizing in a way that interstate wise we are both one in blue states actually forcing our state government to maximize, and then red states being the ones who say we actually need you guys to do this. It's not you guys violating our state rights, like we need you to help us. And then even purple states, I'm not sure what purple states would do, but you're also in danger because I mean, let's be honest. So hopefully this serves as an idea as to like realistic things that we can do, because ultimately what Jasmine Crockett position is true, right? Because they may win this battle, and I think they will, but they don't have to win the war. But that doesn't start at the willingness of the political elected officials, right? It starts at the forcing of we the people, and that's not against the federal government. It is against the state to pressure against the federal government, right? So something like this is something that will be impactful, because ultimately it's not just people just standing around. It's a goal, right? It's a goal to defend democracy. It's a goal to actually start our offense rather than defense, and that starts with forcing it from the bottom up, from the people to the state government. And that's something that we have to consider. I got ADHD, so I have executive dysfunction, so I'm not gonna do it. Usually I'm on the shadows. I'm not really that guy who's like, let's go do this, right? I'm usually the helper, right? That's what I do when it comes to the organizations that I'm helping in. But ultimately, we have to think strategically. We have to have new thinking, and these are the type of new thinkings that will actually help us contribute a much more forceful state government against the federal, because they don't want to do it because they're scared of the consequences. So we have to ensure that we let them know that it's okay. It's okay, because we'll rather have democracy than have whatever the fuck appeasement to a tyrant will give us.